The light on the wall turned from a soft, calming blue to a harsh, blinking red. I did not need a loud siren to tell me that someone was in my house. I could feel the change in the air. When you spend 50 years building the most secret and secure vaults in the world, you don't just see security, you feel it in your skin. I reached for the tablet on my nightstand to check the cameras, but the screen stayed black. In the center of the dark glass, a small message appeared in white letters. Access denied. Property of Julian. My own son's name was the password to my prison. I sat up slowly, my old bones clicking like the gears of a clock. Outside my heavy bedroom door, I heard the sound of heavy boots on the hardwood floor. Those were not the light steps of my son. Those were the boots of men who move with a plan. I looked at the clock. It was 3:12 in the morning. This house, the one I had built to be the safest place on earth, had just become a trap, and the person who had handed over the keys was the boy I had raised. My name is Elias Thorne. In the world of high-security locks, they used to call me the Ghost. I didn't just pick locks, I designed them so that they couldn't be picked. I built safes for banks, for governments, and for people with secrets they wanted to take to the grave. I understood the language of metal. I knew how a pin felt when it dropped into a hole, and I knew the sound of a bolt sliding home. When I retired, I built this house on a quiet piece of land. I filled it with every smart technology and mechanical trick I knew. I wanted peace. I wanted to know that even if the whole world went crazy, I would be safe inside these walls. I also wanted a place for Julian. He had always been a fast learner, but he lacked the patience for the craft. He wanted the reward without the work. He liked the idea of being a master locksmith, but he spent more time in the city losing money than he did in the workshop learning how to feel the tension of a spring. I stayed very still in my bed, listening. I heard a voice I didn't know. "Is he in there?" the voice asked. It was a deep, rough voice. "Yes," a second voice answered. My heart sank. That second voice belonged to Julian. The door is solid steel, just like the rest of them. You can't just kick it in. I told you, you need the master bypass, and I don't have it. My father didn't give me the final code. I heard a dull thud, like someone being pushed against a wall. Then you better find a way to get it from him, kid, the rough voice hissed. We didn't come all this way just to stare at a door. We need that prototype from the basement vault. If we don't have it by sunrise, you're going to be the first thing we leave behind. I realized then that Julian wasn't just a part of this. He was in trouble. He had probably gambled away money he didn't have to people who didn't take no for an answer. He had promised them the one thing he thought he could steal from me, my latest design. The prototype in the basement was a magnetic gravity lock. It was a project I had worked on for 5 years. It didn't use keys or codes in the normal way. It used the weight and pull of the earth itself. It was worth millions to the right people, and it was the only one of its kind. I hadn't even told Julian how it worked. I knew he was looking for a way to get rich quick, and I didn't want him tempted. But it seemed the temptation had found him anyway. I stood up and walked to my closet. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. I knew every inch of this room by touch. Behind my hanging shirts, there was a small wooden panel. It looked like part of the wall, but when I pressed a specific spot, it slid back. Inside was a mechanical override. A simple lever made of brass. No computers, no wires, no smart anything. Just a piece of metal that moved another piece of metal. I pulled the lever. In the hallway, I heard the sound of the house's power cutting out. The red blinking lights died. The electronic locks on the doors didn't open, they deadlocked. This was my fail-safe. If someone hacked the system, I could turn the whole house into a giant, unpowered box. Now, the only way to move from room to room was with physical keys, and I was the only one who had them. I heard the men in the hallway swearing. "The power's out," one yelled. "Julian, what did you do?" Julian sounded terrified. "I didn't do anything. It must be a circuit breaker. I told you this place was complicated." I smiled to myself. Julian knew about the tech, but he forgot that his father was a man who grew up with iron and fire. He forgot that I always kept a back door for myself. I reached into a small safe in the wall and pulled out a ring of keys. They were heavy and cold in my hand. I also grabbed a small flashlight and a heavy wrench. I wasn't a young man anymore, but I knew my house better than any map. I opened a small hatch in the floor of my closet that led to a crawlspace. This was how I would move. I crawled into the dark, feeling the cool concrete beneath me. I could hear the men above me, their heavy boots thumping on the floorboards. There were at least 3 of them, plus Julian. They were moving toward the kitchen, probably looking for a way down to the basement. But the basement door was a 3-ton slab of reinforced concrete hidden behind a fake pantry wall. Julian knew where it was, but he didn't know how to trigger the opening mechanism without power. I moved through the crawlspace until I was under the living room. I could hear them talking clearly now. "We're wasting time," the leader said. "Julian, get over here. If this door doesn't open, I'm going to start breaking things. Maybe I'll start with your fingers." I heard Julian's voice, shaking. "Please, just wait. I can figure it out. There has to be a manual release. My father wouldn't build a house he couldn't get out of." I felt a sting of sadness. Julian was right, but he was using my own logic against me. I had taught him to think like a builder, and now he was using that to help criminals rob me. I realized I couldn't just hide. I had to teach Julian one last lesson, and I had to make sure these men never came back. I reached the end of the crawlspace and pushed up a small tile under the sofa. I peeked into the room. The men were using flashlights. I saw 3 large men in dark jackets. They had tools, drills, saws, and crowbars, but those things were useless against my walls. Julian was standing near the pantry, his face pale and covered in sweat. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He looked at the pantry wall with a mix of fear and greed. I saw one of the men pull out a handgun. "5 minutes," the man said. "Then we start the loud way." I knew what the loud way meant. They would use explosives. They didn't care if they destroyed the house or killed me, as long as they got the lock. I dropped the tile back into place and moved toward the basement. I had to get there first. I had to protect the prototype, but more than that, I had to protect my son from making a mistake he could never take back. I reached the basement access and climbed out. I was inside the vault room before they even knew I was out of bed. The room was silent and cold. The prototype sat on a pedestal in the center. It looked like a simple silver sphere, but inside was a masterpiece of engineering. I walked over to it and placed my hand on the cold metal. "Not today," I whispered. I didn't take the prototype. Instead, I did something much more dangerous. I changed the settings. I turned the magnetic pull to its highest level. If anyone with metal on them, like a gun or a crowbar, came within 10 feet of it, they would be stuck to it like glue. I heard the sound of the pantry wall being forced open. They had found the manual lever. Julian must have remembered me talking about it years ago. I heard the heavy slab of the basement door groan as it began to move. I didn't run. I sat in a chair in the corner of the room, tucked into the shadows. I wanted them to see me. I wanted Julian to see me. The door swung open, and the flashlights cut through the darkness. The 4 of them stepped into the room. The leader was in front, his gun pointed at the center of the room. Julian was at the back, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "There it is," the leader said, his eyes going wide as his light hit the silver sphere. "The payday." He started to walk forward. Julian followed, his eyes searching the shadows. He stopped when he saw me. "Dad," he whispered. The other men turned their lights toward me. I sat there, perfectly still, my hands resting on my knees. "Hello, Julian," I said. My voice was calm and steady. "I see you brought some friends over. You should have called first. I would have made tea." The leader laughed, a cold, dry sound. "Old man, you've got guts. I'll give you that. Now, stay in that chair and nobody gets hurt. We just want the ball, and then we're gone." I looked at the leader. "I'm afraid you can't have the ball. It's not finished. And besides, it's very picky about who touches it." The leader sneered and took another step toward the pedestal. He was now only 8 feet away. Suddenly, I heard a loud clang. The gun in the leader's hand was ripped out of his grip. It flew through the air and smashed against the silver sphere, sticking to it with a powerful force. The man yelled in surprise. The other 2 men reached for their tools, but their crowbars and drills were also pulled from their hands. They crashed against the sphere, piling up in a mess of metal. The men were thrown off balance, their belts and watches pulling them toward the pedestal. "What is this?" the leader screamed, trying to pull his gun free. But it was no use. The magnetic pull was too strong. They were trapped in the center of the room, struggling against a force they couldn't see. Julian had stayed near the door. He didn't have any metal on him except for his belt buckle, which was pulling at his waist, but he was far enough away to stay on his feet. He looked at the men, then at me. He looked horrified. "Dad, stop it. You're going to kill them." I stood up slowly. "I'm not doing anything, Julian. The lock is doing the work. This is what happens when you try to take something you don't understand." I walked toward my son. I could see the shame in his eyes. "You told them about the vault, didn't you?" Julian looked down at the floor. "I had to, Dad. I owed them so much. They were going to kill me." I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder. "They were going to kill you anyway, Julian. People like this don't leave witnesses. They used you to get inside, and they would have left you in the dark." I looked at the 3 men. They were pinned against the pedestal now, their clothes caught between their tools and the sphere. They were swearing and yelling, but they couldn't move. "Julian," I said, my voice soft. "There is a police station 5 miles from here. I want you to go there. Tell them everything. Tell them about the money, tell them about the men, and tell them about the house. If you do this now, maybe you can save yourself. If you stay here, you're just another criminal caught in the trap." Julian looked at me, his eyes filling with tears. "You're not coming with me." I shook my head. "I have to stay here and watch my guests. I have to make sure they don't go anywhere. Go now, Julian. Run." Julian looked at the men, then back at me. He turned and ran out of the basement. I heard his footsteps disappearing up the stairs. I was alone with the 3 intruders. I walked over to a control panel on the wall, one that worked on a separate battery, and turned on the room lights. The men squinted in the brightness. "Let us go, old man," the leader barked. "We'll leave. We'll never come back. Just turn it off." I sat back down in my chair. "I don't think so. You see, this lock is designed to stay on until it's reset from the outside. And I'm not feeling very helpful tonight." I picked up a book I had left on the side table earlier. It was a book about the history of clockmaking. I opened it to the first page and started to read. The men kept yelling for a while, but eventually, they realized I wasn't listening. They became quiet, save for the occasional groan as the magnets pulled at their gear. I sat there in the silence of my vault, reading my book and waiting for the sirens. I felt a deep sadness for my son, but I also felt a small spark of hope. He had chosen to run toward the police, not away from them. He had taken the first step toward fixing his life. An hour passed. Then 2. I heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. Then I heard the front door being opened. Not with a crowbar, but with a key. Julian had the spare I kept under the porch. I heard many voices, the heavy tread of police boots, and the sharp commands of officers. A few minutes later, the vault door opened again. A dozen officers poured into the room, their weapons ready. Julian was with them. He was in handcuffs, but he was walking with his head up. He looked at me, and I gave him a small, tired nod. "Mr. Thorne," a sergeant asked, looking at the men stuck to the silver ball. "Are you all right?" I closed my book and stood up. "I'm fine, Sergeant. But I think my guests would like to leave now. If you could just have your men stand back, I'll turn off the magnet." The officers moved back, looking at the prototype with wonder. I pressed a sequence on the wall panel. There was a soft hum, and then the metal tools and guns fell to the floor with a series of loud thuds. The 3 men collapsed, their muscles weak from the strain. The officers moved in quickly and moved them out of the room. I walked over to Julian. The sergeant let us have a moment alone. "I told them everything, Dad," Julian whispered. "Everything." I looked at him. His face was bruised, and he looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear for the first time in years. "I know you did, son. It's going to be hard for a long time. You're going to have to pay for what you did." Julian nodded. "I know. But at least I'm not in the dark anymore." I hugged him then, a tight, brief hug. Then the officers led him away. I stood in my basement, looking at the prototype. It was scratched and covered in oil from the tools, but it was still perfect. I realized then that I didn't want to live in a house full of traps anymore. I didn't want to be the ghost. I wanted to be a father. I wanted to be a man who could sit on his porch without a censor telling him who was coming. I walked over to the main power switch and turned it back on. The house filled with light. The red blinking moved back to blue. I walked up the stairs and into the kitchen. I made a pot of tea and sat at the table, watching the sun begin to rise over the hills. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of a vault. It was the silence of a new day. I knew the road ahead for Julian would be long and difficult, but I would be there at the end of it. I would help him build a new life, not with shortcuts and fast money, but with the slow, steady work of an honest man. I picked up my tea and took a sip. The sun was warm on my face. I looked at the workshop in the yard and decided that tomorrow, I would start taking down the high-tech cameras. I would keep the locks, of course. A man can't change his nature entirely, but I would leave the doors unlocked more often. I was tired of being safe. I wanted to be alive. The tea in my cup was cold, but I didn't get up to warm it. I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, the only light coming from the moon hitting the silver toaster on the counter. I wasn't looking at the moon, though. I was looking at the small, green light on the wall by the back door. It should have been a steady green, but every few minutes, it gave a tiny, almost invisible flicker. To anyone else, it would have looked like a loose bulb or a tiny power surge. To me, it was a heartbeat. It meant that someone was outside, tapping into the fiber optic line that ran under the gravel. They weren't trying to break in, not yet. They were listening. They were trying to see if the ghost had really gone soft. I kept my breathing slow and even. I didn't reach for my tablet. I didn't move toward the door. I just sat there, an old man in a dark house, knowing that the arrest of those 3 men in the basement had only been the first click of a very long and dangerous combination. The people Julian owed money to weren't just street thugs. They were professionals, and I had something they wanted far more than a silver ball. I had the knowledge of how to bypass every security system they would ever face. And now that they knew where I lived, they were never going to stop turning the dial until they hit the jackpot. The days following the arrest were filled with lawyers, police officers, and long drives to the city. I had to see Julian. He was being held in a high-security wing of the county jail. Seeing him there, behind a thick pane of glass, was a different kind of pain than I had ever known. He looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit. The bravado was gone. The fast talker had finally run out of words. When I picked up the phone to talk to him, his hand was shaking so hard he almost dropped the receiver. He told me about a man named Victor. Victor wasn't a gambler or a thief, he was a broker. He dealt in information. He was the one who had given Julian the money to cover his debts, but the price wasn't cash. The price was me. Victor wanted a universal key, a digital and mechanical ghost key that could open the new line of biometric safes being used by the world's biggest banks. Julian had promised him that I could build it. He had sold my name to a shark, and now the shark was hungry. "I'm sorry, Dad," Julian whispered, his voice cracking through the speaker. "I told them you wouldn't do it. I told them you were retired. But Victor doesn't care. He said if I don't give him the designs, he'll make sure I never walk out of this jail, even if the judge lets me off. He has people everywhere." I looked at my son, and for a moment, I didn't see the man who had betrayed me. I saw the child who used to sit on my lap and watch me work on old padlocks. I saw the fear in his eyes, and I knew that my quiet life was over. I couldn't just sit on my porch and drink tea. I had to go back into the shadows one last time. I told Julian to stay quiet and not to talk to anyone, not even the guards. I told him that I would handle Victor. I didn't tell him how. I didn't want him to know what I was capable of when I was pushed into a corner. When I got home that night, the house felt different. It didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a target. I walked through every room, not looking at the furniture or the pictures, but looking at the seams of the walls and the frames of the windows. I found 3 more taps on my lines. They were sophisticated, the kind of gear that only governments or very wealthy criminals could afford. I didn't remove them. In the world of security, if you find a bug, you don't always crush it. Sometimes, you feed it. You give it exactly what it wants to hear so that the person on the other end thinks they are in control. I went into my workshop and turned on the lights. I made sure to walk with a slight limp, acting like an old man who was tired and defeated. I sat at my bench and pulled out a large sheet of drafting paper. I started drawing. I drew the designs for a universal key. I made the diagrams look complex and beautiful. I used real math and real engineering terms. To anyone who knew a little bit about locks, it would look like the most valuable piece of technology in the world. But deep inside the logic of the machine, I built a flaw. It was a time lock virus. The key would work perfectly for exactly 3 uses. It would open any door, bypass any sensor, and leave no trace. But on the 4th use, it would trigger every alarm in a 5-mile radius and lock the user inside whatever room they had entered. It would turn a master thief into a trapped rat. I worked on the drawings for 3 nights, knowing that Victor's people were watching through the cameras they had surely hidden in the rafters. I let them see my struggle. I let them see me drinking too much coffee and rubbing my eyes in frustration. I wanted them to believe I was desperate to save my son. On the 4th morning, a car pulled up to my gate. It was a white delivery van with a logo for a flower shop on the side. A man in a green uniform walked up to the porch carrying a large box of roses. I met him at the door. He didn't offer me the flowers. He just looked at me with cold, blue eyes. "Victor is getting impatient, Elias," the man said. "He heard you were working on something special. He'd like to see the progress." I didn't act surprised. I just stepped back and let him in. I led him to the workshop and pointed at the drafting table. The man looked at the drawings for a long time. He took out a small camera and scanned every inch of the paper. He didn't ask questions. He just finished his work, put the camera away, and walked back to the van. "You have 1 week to build the prototype," he said before driving away. "If it's not ready, Julian gets moved to the general population. You know what happens to people like him in there." I watched the van disappear down the road. I had 1 week. It wasn't enough time to build a real machine, but it was plenty of time to build a trap. I started gathering parts. I didn't order them online where they could be tracked. I drove to old scrapyards and pawn shops in 3 different states. I bought old computer boards, pieces of brass from discarded clocks, and tiny motors from children's toys. I was building a puzzle, and I was the only one who knew how the pieces fit together. As I worked, I felt the old energy coming back to me. The ghost wasn't just a nickname, it was a mindset. It was the ability to see the world as a series of connected points and knowing exactly where to apply pressure to make the whole thing collapse. I wasn't just building a key for Victor. I was building a path that would lead him straight to a prison cell next to Julian. Halfway through the week, I received a phone call from a woman named Detective Miller. She was the one who had handled the first arrest at my house. She wanted to know if I had heard from Julian's friends again. I told her I hadn't. I lied to the police because I knew that if they got involved now, Victor would vanish back into the dark, and Julian would be the one who paid the price. This had to be a private game. I had to be the one to hand Victor over, tied in a neat bow of his own greed. Detective Miller sounded suspicious, but she didn't push. She told me to stay safe and to call her if I saw anything unusual. I thanked her and hung up, then went back to my workbench. I felt a small pang of guilt for lying to a good cop, but in my world, the law was often too slow to catch a man like Victor. You had to use the shadows to catch the shadows. As the deadline approached, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. I could feel the eyes on me at all times. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom and started sleeping on a cot in the workshop. I wanted to make sure that if they tried to take the prototype early, I would be right there to stop them. On the final night, I sat at the bench and did the final assembly. The universal key was a small, elegant device that fit in the palm of a hand. It was made of brushed steel and had a tiny touchscreen on the top. It looked like a piece of the future. I held it in my hand and felt its weight. It was a beautiful lie. I packed it into a small, velvet-lined box and sat by the door. I didn't have to wait long. At midnight, the white van returned. This time, 3 men got out. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore tactical gear and carried silenced submachine guns. They didn't knock. They used a professional-grade bypass tool on my front door. I watched them on my internal monitor as they moved through the house with military precision. They reached the workshop and kicked the door open. I sat in my chair, the velvet box on my lap. The leader of the group stepped forward. He was a tall man with a scar running across his nose. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. I handed him the box. He opened it, looked at the device, and nodded to the others. "Victor will be pleased," he said. He looked at me for a moment, and I saw a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. "You're a legend, Elias. It's a shame you wasted your talent on a son like that. They didn't kill me. They didn't even tie me up. They just took the box and disappeared into the night. They thought they had won. They thought they had the ultimate weapon." I sat in the workshop for an hour, listening to the silence return to the house. Then, I walked over to my main computer. I didn't use the keyboard. I used a small, hidden remote that I had kept in my pocket. I pressed a single button. On my screen, a map of the city appeared. A small, blue dot was moving quickly toward the downtown area. The universal key had a built-in GPS tracker that ran on the kinetic energy of the device moving. As long as they were carrying it, I knew exactly where they were. I watched the dot stop at a luxury apartment building near the waterfront. That would be Victor's headquarters. I didn't call the police yet. I needed them to use the key first. I needed the evidence of the crime. I waited through the night, watching the blue dot. At 4 a.m., the dot started moving again. It traveled to the Diamond District. I felt my heart race. They were going for a big score. They were going to use my key to enter one of the most secure vaults in the country. I watched as the dot stopped at the back entrance of a massive jewelry exchange. I looked at the clock. They would be inside in minutes. I opened a second window on my computer and accessed the exchange's security feed. I had hacked into their system months ago, just to see if I could. I saw the three men from the van moving through the corridors. They reached the main vault. The leader pulled out the universal key and touched it to the biometric scanner. The light on the vault turned green. The massive steel door swung open without a sound. It was a perfect performance. The men entered the vault and started filling bags with diamonds and gold. They moved with the confidence of men who knew they were invisible. They finished their work and moved to the second vault. A smaller, private one used by a billionaire. Again, the key worked perfectly. Green light. Open door. They were halfway through their third vault when the blue dot on my screen started to blink red. This was it. The third use was complete. The fourth use would be the end. They moved to the final exit door, the one that led to the street. The leader touched the key to the scanner one last time. Instead of a green light, the entire building erupted in a blinding strobe of white light. A siren louder than a jet engine began to scream. Every door in the building, every single one, slammed shut and deadlocked. The steel shutters on the windows dropped with the force of a guillotine. The universal key in the leader's hand began to emit a thick, purple smoke that would stain their skin and clothes for weeks. I watched on the camera as the men panicked. They tried to use their tools to force the doors, but the locks I had described in the key's manual had actually been reinforced by the building's own security system when the virus triggered. They were trapped in a steel box, surrounded by millions of dollars in stolen gems, with a silent alarm calling every police officer in the city. I picked up my phone and dialed Detective Miller's direct line. "Detective," I said, my voice calm. "I think you should head down to the Diamond Exchange. There are some men there you might want to talk to. And if you check the leader's pocket, you'll find a device that links directly to a man named Victor. He's currently at the waterfront apartments, probably waiting for a phone call that's never going to come." I hung up before she could ask any questions. I walked out to my porch and sat in my rocking chair. The sun was starting to come up. For the first time in a week, the house felt like it belonged to me again. I watched the birds start to sing, and I felt the weight of the ghost begin to slip away. A few hours later, the news was full of the story. The Great Diamond Trap, they called it. The police had caught the thieves red-handed, and the device they found had led them straight to Victor's front door. By noon, the entire organization had been dismantled. Victor was in custody, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. I received a message from Julian's lawyer. Because of the information I had provided and the role Julian had played in helping catch the syndicate, the prosecutor was willing to offer him a plea deal. He would serve 2 years in a low-security facility, and then he would be free. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance. It was a foundation. I drove back to the jail to see Julian one last time before he was moved. He looked different. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet realization of how close he had come to losing everything. We didn't talk through the glass this time. We were allowed a contact visit in a small room. I sat across from him and looked at his hands. They were steady now. "You did it, Dad," he said. "You beat them." I shook my head. "We beat them, Julian. But I won't be there to build a key for you next time. You have to learn how to open your own doors from now on. Julian nodded. I know. I want to learn. When I get out, I want to come back to the workshop. Not for the money. Just to learn how things work. I left the jail and drove home. I felt a sense of peace, but I also knew that the world was still a dangerous place. I had protected my son, and I had protected my work, but I had also revealed myself to people who would remember my name. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw a black sedan parked by the gate. A man in a dark suit was leaning against the hood. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like an official. My heart gave a small thump. The game wasn't over. It had just changed levels. I parked my car and walked up to him. He held out a badge. Elias Thorne. My name is Agent Graves. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. We've been looking at the device you used to catch Victor. It's a very impressive piece of work. We'd like to talk to you about some other vaults. I looked at the man, then at my house. I thought about the tea I wanted to drink and the quiet porch I wanted to sit on. I thought about Julian and the long 2 years ahead. I realized that the ghost could never truly retire. The world would always need someone who knew how to keep the secret safe, or how to break the ones that were hidden by the wrong people. I smiled a small, tired smile. I'm retired, Agent Graves, I said. But I suppose I could listen to what you have to say. Just let me make a pot of tea first. It's going to be a long conversation. I led him into the house, and as the door clicked shut behind us, I knew that the combination was finally set. The locks were secure, the path was clear, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just hiding. I was ready. The high-pitched whine of a surveillance drone had been hovering just outside my bedroom window for 3 days, a persistent mosquito of the state that refused to be swatted away. I didn't need to look at the sky to know it was there. I could hear the specific frequency of its rotors reflecting off the reinforced glass of my balcony. It was 4:14 a.m., and the house was screaming at me in a language of vibrations and silent alerts. Agent Graves hadn't just come for tea. He had come to colonize my life. Every time I moved, a sensor in the hallway logged my weight. Every time I opened a drawer, a remote thermal camera mapped the contents. But the most terrifying sound wasn't the drone or the hum of the government's eyes, it was the silence from the low-security facility where Julian was supposed to be serving his time. I had checked the inmate roster 5 minutes ago, and for the first time in 6 months, my son's name had been replaced by a string of red zeros. Administrative transfer, the screen had read. In the world of black site operations, that was the code for a kidnapping with a federal seal. I sat at my workbench, the cold steel of a precision file in my hand, and I didn't look up when the back door chime sounded. I didn't need to. I knew the weight of the man entering by the way the floor joists groaned. Graves walked into the workshop, his suit perfectly pressed despite the hour. He didn't speak. He just laid a tablet on the scarred wood of my table. On the screen was a live feed of a room made entirely of white plastic. Julian was sitting in a chair in the center, looking up at a camera he couldn't see. He wasn't in an orange jumpsuit anymore. He was wearing a gray tunic, the kind they give to people who don't officially exist. Graves leaned over, his voice a low, sandpaper rasp. He's at a facility we call the Vault, Elias. Fitting, isn't it? It's a subterranean complex built in the 60s, updated with every piece of tech you ever invented and some you haven't even dreamed of yet. We have a problem. A group of internal dissidents, men who used to work for me, have taken over the lower levels. They've locked themselves in with a prototype we were developing. And they took your son as a human shield because they know he's the only person you'd ever break a law for. I looked at Graves, and I saw the truth behind his cold eyes. He wasn't there to rescue Julian out of the goodness of his heart. He had lost control of his own monster, and he needed the ghost to clean up the mess. You want me to break into a government black site, I said, my voice as steady as a mountain. Graves nodded. Not just break in. I want you to ghost the entire system. If you go in through the front, they'll kill him the second they see a uniform on the monitors. You have to go in the way only you know how, through the seams. You have 3 hours before the military moves in with a thermobaric charge to sanitize the site. If that happens, Julian becomes a footnote in a classified report. I didn't hesitate. I reached for my heavy leather tool roll. I didn't need a gun. I didn't need a team. I needed the silver nitrate picks I had forged in 1982 and the stethoscope that could hear the heartbeat of a tumbler through 6 inches of lead. We moved under the cover of a simulated power outage. Graves dropped me 2 miles from the entrance of the facility, a nondescript ventilation building in the middle of a forest. As I stepped out of the black SUV, the rain began to fall, a cold, biting autumn drench that soaked through my jacket instantly. I didn't mind. The rain provided acoustic cover. I found the vent, a massive iron grate held in place by 4 grade 8 security bolts. They were designed to be impossible to turn from the outside, but I had built the machine that threaded those bolts. I knew that if you applied a specific vibration to the head, a rhythmic tapping at 440 Hz, the metal would expand just enough to lose its grip. I used a tuning fork I'd kept in my pocket since the 90s. Tap. 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 The bolts surrendered. I dropped into the darkness, the smell of ozone and old dust filling my lungs. This was my world. This was the belly of the beast. The air in the tunnels was filtered and thin. I moved through the ductwork like a shadow, my fingers tracing the rivets. Every 50 feet, there was a motion sensor, but these were the old Mark IV models. I knew they had a blind spot exactly 3 inches from the floor where the infrared beam didn't quite reach because of the way the sensors were angled to avoid detecting rodents. I crawled on my belly, the cold metal pressing against my chest. I reached the first internal security door, a biometric scanner tied to a pressure-sensitive floor. This was the moment of truth. If Julian had remembered anything I taught him, he would have left me a sign. I looked at the keypad. It was clean, wiped down with alcohol. But then I saw it, a tiny, microscopic scratch on the 5 key, followed by a 9, 2, and a 1. It was the combination to the first safe I had ever taught him to crack when he was 12 years old. He was talking to me through the hardware. He knew I was coming. I bypassed the door by jumping the solenoid with a 9-volt battery and a piece of copper wire. The lock clicked with a sound like a polite cough, and I stepped into the sublevel. The lights were dim, flickering in a rhythmic pattern. It wasn't a malfunction, it was a signal. Long short long. Morse code. LEVLFOUR. The rebels were holding him in the server room, the heart of the facility. I moved through the shadows of the corridor, avoiding the sweep of the automated turrets. These were the new models, the ones that looked for heat signatures. I had prepared for this. I pulled a thin, mylar-lined blanket over my shoulders, trapping my body heat inside. To the machines, I was just a cold patch of air moving through the hall. I reached the elevator shaft and didn't call the car. I climbed the cables, my muscles burning, my lungs screaming for air. I was 73 years old, but in that moment, I was a ghost made of iron. I reached level 4 and peered through a small maintenance hatch. The server room was a sea of blue lights and humming cooling fans. I saw 3 men, all dressed in black tactical gear, pacing the perimeter. Julian was tied to a chair near the central terminal. He looked battered, his lips split and his eyes swollen, but his gaze was fixed on the door. He wasn't looking for a savior, he was looking for a distraction. I realized then that Julian hadn't just been a victim. He had been working on the terminal. The dissidents needed him to unlock the final encryption on the prototype, and he was stalling them, intentionally failing to bypass the security layers to buy me time. He saw a flicker of movement in the vent, my eyes catching the light, and he didn't blink. He just started talking, his voice loud enough to carry over the fans. I told you, the gravity lock requires a secondary pulse. If I force it, the whole room will depressurize. You want the tech, you have to let me do it my way. The leader of the rebels, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, shoved Julian's head toward the screen. Do it now, or the old man dies next. We know Graves went to see him. I knew I had seconds. I didn't have a weapon, but I was in a room full of high-voltage cooling systems. I reached into my tool roll and pulled out a small canister of liquid nitrogen I'd smuggled in. I sprayed it directly onto the main fire suppression pipe above the guards' heads. The metal, already under pressure, became brittle in seconds. I hit the pipe with my heavy wrench. It shattered with the sound of a grenade going off. A cloud of freezing chemical fire suppressant filled the room, blinding the guards and triggering the emergency lockdown sirens. In the chaos, I dropped from the vent. I didn't go for the guards, I went for the terminal. I slammed my master override key. The real one, the one I had never shown anyone, into the port. Close your eyes, Julian. I screamed. I triggered the magnetic pulse I had designed for the prototype. It wasn't a trap this time, it was a localized EMP. Every piece of electronic equipment in the room fried in a shower of sparks. The guards' radios exploded, and their high-tech goggles blinded them with feedback. The room went pitch black, the only light coming from the orange glow of the dying servers. I reached Julian in 3 strides, my knife slicing through his zip ties. He didn't ask questions. He grabbed my arm, and we ran. We didn't head for the exit, we headed for the trash compactor. It was the only exit that didn't rely on electronic sensors during a lockdown. We slid down the chute, landing in a pile of shredded documents and plastic. We were in the basement, the lowest point of the facility, and the air was thick with the smell of scorched earth. We found a service tunnel that led to the old drainage system. As we crawled through the mud and the dark, Julian grabbed my hand. Dad, I didn't give them the code. I told them I forgot it. I knew you'd find the rivets. I didn't say anything, I just squeezed his hand. We emerged into the forest a mile away from the ventilation building, just as the sky turned a bruised purple with the coming dawn. In the distance, we heard a muffled thud that shook the ground beneath our feet. Graves had kept his word, or at least, his version of it. The thermobaric charge had been detonated. The dissidents, the prototype, and the evidence of the administrative transfer were all gone, buried under 1,000,000 tons of collapsed concrete. To the world, Level 4 had never existed. To the world, Julian Thorne was still sitting in a low-security cell, and Elias Thorne was just an old man asleep in his workshop. Graves was waiting for us by the same black SUV. He looked at us. 2 men covered in mud, grease, and blood, and he didn't offer a towel. He just held out a folder. New identities. New location. A quiet town in the Pacific Northwest. You'll have a house, a workshop, and a clean record. But you never design another lock, Elias. Not even a birdhouse. If I see a blueprint with your signature on it, this deal ends. I took the folder and looked him in the eye. I'm done with locks, Graves. I've found something much harder to pick. I looked at Julian. He was shivering, but he was standing tall. He looked like a man who had finally found his own center of gravity. We got into the car, and as we drove away from the forest, I watched the smoke from the facility rise into the clouds. The ghost was finally dead, and for the first time in 50 years, the door behind me wasn't locked. We settled in a town where the trees were so tall they blotted out the sun and the rain never really stopped. It was a place where people didn't ask about your past, mainly because they were all trying to forget their own. Our new house was old, made of cedar and stone, with a porch that creaked in the wind. There were no cameras. There were no sensors. There was only the sound of the ocean a few miles away. Julian took a job at the local boatyard, repairing engines. He liked the honesty of it, the way a motor either worked or it didn't, with no room for lies or shortcuts. I spent my days in the garden, planting things that would take years to grow. I realized that a garden is the opposite of a vault. A vault is built to keep things out, a garden is built to let things in. One evening, a year later, Julian came home with a small wooden box. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at me. "I found this at an estate sale," he said. It was an old maritime chronometer from the 19th century, its brass casing tarnished green and its gears frozen by 100 years of salt air. I tried to fix it, but I can't get the escapement to click. I thought, maybe you could take a look. I looked at the box, and I felt the old itch in my fingers. I looked at the folder Graves had given me, tucked away in a drawer. Then I looked at my son. He wasn't asking for a payday. He was asking for a moment with his father. I reached for my glasses and a small set of jeweler's screwdrivers. I didn't need a blueprint. I didn't need a code. I just needed to listen. As I turned the first screw, the brass gave a soft, familiar protest. I worked slowly, my hand steady, my mind clear. Julian sat across from me, watching my every move. I explained the mechanism to him, how the tension of the spring had to be balanced against the weight of the balance wheel, how time itself was just a series of perfectly timed releases. We sat there for hours, the light of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. There was no red blinking light. There was no drone outside the window. There was only the ticking of the clock as it slowly came back to life. Tick. 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 It was the sound of a heart beating in a quiet room. It was the sound of a father and a son finding a rhythm they could finally live by. The clock finally hummed, the tiny gears spinning with a precision that felt like music. Julian smiled, a real, bright smile that reached his eyes. "It's perfect, Dad." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the years finally feeling light. "No, Julian," I said, looking at him. "It's just right." I realized then that I hadn't just fixed a clock. I had fixed the only thing that ever mattered. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain on the roof. The world was full of locks and keys, but I didn't need them anymore. I had the only thing that was truly secure. A son who knew his way home and a father who was finally there to meet him. The ghost was gone, and in his place was a man who knew exactly where he belonged. The sun rose the next morning, not over a vault of steel, but over a forest of green. Julian went to work, and I went to my garden. As I dug my hands into the cool, damp earth, I felt the last of the metal tension leave my soul. I was Elias Thorne, and I didn't have a single secret left to hide. I was just a man with a garden, a son, and a clock that told the truth. And as the birds began to sing their morning songs, I knew that the combination to a happy life wasn't a series of numbers, it was the courage to leave the door open and trust that what came through it would be worth the risk. The mission was finally, truly, completed.